Yeah, no, I think that my book is like a drug. And I've just given this new drug to people who've never tried it before. And for a lot of people, whether or not they've tried psychedelics, the book itself, it's like all of my psychedelic experiences and everything else combined. So then the single 12-hour experience of that is a new substance. It's like a new alteration of consciousness. And even people who are very experienced with drugs, except for the people who are the most experienced, it doesn't faze them at all. They love it. But everyone else is kind of like, what do I even do with this? Like, it doesn't fit into any category they know of.
Yeah. I love that you start off the book by saying you've tried to make it as true to what happened as possible. And I think that's a really great way to start, because you do go into so many visions and things that happened during like altered states that you are kind of trying to piece back together in the book. And I think it's so powerful the way that you do it. And we kind of get to go on this huge journey with you. And I honestly thought that your time at Johns Hopkins was going to be like, I thought your time leaving would be like near the end, but that was like almost the catalyst of your book, and the journey that you've gone on from it has been just really profound. So yeah, I'm really excited to talk about it. Let's go ahead and do like our names real quick before we have a chance to forget. You're listening to the Tripsitter podcast, where we demystify substances, break down the science behind them, and discuss the crazy world of psychedelic culture. Like having a Tripsitter watch over your experience, our goal is to provide guidance and support in preparation for your psychedelic journey. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the trip. Hi, I'm James, and I'm a contributor at Tripsitter.
I'm Justin. I'm the founder, editor-in-chief at Tripsitter.
And I'm Katherine MacLean. I was a research scientist at Johns Hopkins. And then a whole bunch of stuff happened in my life that propelled me on amazing adventures. And I wrote a book about it. And that just came out this year.
We're truly honored to have you here.
Yeah, seriously.
Catherine.
Thank you.
There's nothing out there that's like this book. It's amazing. And you're so raw and honest in it. And I just want to start off wondering, like, what was it like writing this book for you? It must have been like carrying an open wound around for months.
That's about right. Well, so I was a bit of an insane person for about 10 years, and I kept lots of journals. So I had a lot of raw material to start with. And I knew since, January 2013 that I was going to write this book. I just didn't know when or how or what it was going to look like. There weren't even any false starts. I just knew that when the moment appeared, I would start and then just finish as fast as possible. So I had tons of journals. I took detailed notes after my drug trips. People are like, how do you remember this stuff? It's like, well, because I wanted to remember it. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's maybe a side note of the book, is that you can remember these moments in your life, but you have to write them down at the moment. You can't assume that 10 years later you're going to remember what happened in that pivotal mushroom experience, a decade ago. So I had a lot of material to work with. COVID had just started, and I think like many writers, it offered an opportunity to finally do that project that you've been putting off. So the whole world stopped. My father-in-law had just died. My dad had just died. It felt like the whole system had crumbled. And I was like, wow, well, this is it. Like, this is the new beginning. When else am I going to do this? So I moved to an island, and my kids started school there. And every single day I wrote for about 6 months. I did take a few weeks off in the middle of that time just to swim and integrate and hang out with friends. And then I distinctly remember the last chapter I wrote. It was in March, and I was like, that's it. It's done. But then what happened in the month after that was I got really, really sick with pneumonia. So I think what was happening was my body was processing everything I had written while I was writing it. And that process lodged itself in my body. And then what happened after that was about a year of trying to heal my body from the experience of writing the book.
Wow.
So yeah, like, people look at it and they're like, oh, congratulations, you wrote your first book. I'm like, you don't understand.
Yeah.
This was my life. Like, I poured my life out into it, and then I had to like recover from that. And now I'm like, here you go, this nice little package.
It's cathartic though, right? Like,
absolutely.
Bring everything out, struggle through it, and then move on with your life in a way.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. But certainly, I think all of the lessons of psychedelics came to pass through the book as well. For me, the book was a psychedelic experience, and then I had to integrate it before I was ready to share it with the world. And I think, again, these are meta issues that unless you're a psychonaut, you're not that interested in. But eventually, the whole world is going to have to know how to do this, because 20 years from now, millions more people have had psychedelic experiences, and they may have just come out of that 10-year period where they're like, what just happened to me? And I think that's the thing that we're not really preparing people for. And that's another reason I wrote this now, is so that people could read it and be like, oh, that's what could happen? Like, I could have one experience and then have to process it for 10 years. It's like, yes, that is what can happen.
It's usually what happens.
Could you kind of take us, for our listeners who are unaware, on like broad strokes journey through the events of the book and what got you to where you're at now?
Yeah. Well, I guess the shortest version of the beginning is that I spent the first 30 years of my life living a very ordinary American, educated, privileged life. I did everything I was supposed to. I was valedictorian in high school. I was captain of the track team. I got into an Ivy League college. And then in college was when my body finally started talking to me. It first spoke to me in injuries that forced me to quit track. It tried to speak to me through binge drinking, like, look at how much pain you're in. You're trying to kill yourself. Like, you better be careful. And that's when psychedelics also entered my life. And eventually it was therapeutic, but I think it started maybe, and I don't know about the, philosophy of some listeners, but I feel like psychedelics came into my life to save my life from this very destructive path that I was on of achievement and, self-denial and not feeling what I was feeling. And then, this is very normal, right? You work all week and then you binge drink on the weekends and then you start over again. You have some kids, you get a job, and then you die. And the psychedelics were like, do you want to do something else with your life? Like anything else? And so my psychedelic self-experimentation at Dartmouth was the thing that inspired me to become a research scientist. I was fascinated by consciousness. I did an undergrad thesis with rhesus monkeys. So that there's a little bit in the book about that I realized one of my monkeys was my first Buddhist teacher, because she was teaching me about the nature of being in prison, in suffering. I went to UC Davis and did some meditation research, which was amazing. And that's what eventually got me to join the Hopkins team. It turned out that Roland Griffiths, who is now a household name, but 10 years ago, 15 years ago, unless you were a drug researcher, you didn't know who this guy was. He was a legend in drug abuse research, but outside of that, you wouldn't know his name. He wasn't in the media, he wasn't on Oprah. And he allowed me to come interview for a postdoc because he was a meditator. And he said he got tons of emails from people who wanted to do drug research, but very few from people who were sincerely interested in consciousness and spirituality. And the second shortest way of saying what happened at Hopkins was that the things that people were experiencing in the session room started to change my consciousness. So much so that I had a spontaneous, sober annihilation experience just sitting in meditation one day that completely destroyed my previous understanding of reality.
Wow.
And that's what really propelled me to leave. And then the mystery just kept getting stranger and stranger after that. But that was really the catalyst. It was a Tucson conference in 2012 where everything blew up. And there was no going back from that. Once you've had an experience like that, maybe there are some people who can just put it on the shelf and never think about it again. But I couldn't. And, here I am 10 years later, much happier, living kind of an ordinary life again. So the other thing is, like, you have an experience like that, and the Buddhists say, chop wood and carry water before enlightenment, and chop wood and carry water after enlightenment. So I'm just, got 2 kids living, in a rural area, teaching math. Like, I have a very ordinary life. If no one knew what happened in the last 10 years, they'd be like, oh, she seems like a pretty happy, normal person. And I think that's the biggest cosmic joke of all of this. Like, I've gone from being very eccentric to kind of normal.
Yeah.
You're chopping your wood and carrying your water.
Right.
Yeah, you talk a lot in the introduction, and I think it sets a great tone for a lot of the themes throughout your book of befriending your monsters. And I noticed that a lot of the book centers around coming to terms with your own trauma, sometimes through psychedelic experiences. Other times you talk about one shamanic experience that has no psychedelics involved. And I thought that was really cool too. But I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit more about the importance of the shadow and your journey as you see it, coming to terms with death, understanding it, and befriending it in a way.
Yeah. That's the major theme of the book. I think, what happens to us as kids And what happens to us at the end of life are kind of these unspoken realities in our culture. We don't really care what a child experiences very much. We just want to make sure they get to adulthood, especially if you've had a privileged upbringing. You got a good education, you always had food on the table, you had a comfortable life, you got to go on vacation. People don't want to talk about what was happening that was terrible. Same with the end of life. If you've had a good life, and then you spend the last 5 years of your life in a prison nursing home, doped up on drugs with nobody to visit you, people are just like, oh, forget that. The ending doesn't matter. The beginning doesn't matter. What they did in the middle is what matters. And I think for me, the beginning and the end suddenly became very important to me. Like, how does your life begin and how does it end? And then the middle is the part that doesn't matter so much. That's just the journey across the river. So when my sister was 26, she got diagnosed with breast cancer. And it wasn't just a random thing. It was a genetic mutation that had been running in our family for at least a few generations. We're not really sure where it started because people just learned about this mutation in the last maybe 25 years. But a great grandmother had died of breast cancer alone in a psychiatric ward, like a mental institution, back when they called them insane asylums. I use that term in the book on purpose to show how people were treated who had mental health issues.
Right.
So she died basically alone of breast cancer in an institution. Then my grandfather died of breast cancer, but we weren't told it was breast cancer. And then my uncle got cancer. And then he was the one who finally was like, what is going on here? So then when my sister got diagnosed, we're like, okay, this is like a big problem in our family and we have to figure this out. But what it revealed was all of the things that hadn't been talked about. So like we've had to learn like, oh, grandpa died of breast cancer. I thought it was lung cancer. No. It was breast cancer that spread to his lungs. Well, why didn't you guys tell us that? Oh, because there was all this kind of like shame, I think, and embarrassment about men having breast cancer, which seems ridiculous, but I think it's really true. He was a World War II fighter pilot at D-Day. It's like men like that don't get breast cancer. We have all these very silly things that we believe in our culture about what men and women are allowed to go through. So